And good morning, everybody. Welcome to the fourth instalment of Steer's Election Reflection Series, where we're bringing together industry experts for 30-minute conversations on the impact of Labour's agenda across cities, transport and infrastructure. My name is Lisa Martin. I'm a director here at Steer, focused largely on delivering sustainable mobility through the design and implementation of travel behaviour change strategies and programmes. Thank you for joining us today for this particular conversation about what a Labour government could mean in terms of transport policy across the UK. I'm very grateful to be joined by my friend and colleague, I should say, Tom Cohen, Reader of Transport Policy at the University of Westminster. Before I introduce Tom properly, just a note that you will find subtitled recordings of this session and our other sessions on our website at steergroup.com. As we're talking, you'll be able to use the comments section to share your views and conversations. But given the sort of short format of these events, we won't be able to respond to the comments or questions live during the session, but we will look at them afterwards and come back on anything we can do. So back to introducing Tom. As I mentioned, Tom is based out of the University of Westminster, where he is also a member of its Active Travel Academy. Tom's main research interests are transport and mobility justice, the democratisation of transport planning and active travel. Before moving into the research sector, Tom spent a decade in transport consultancy for Steer, I'm very happy to say. So, welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's okay. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about the future for sustainable transport. So, let's get started. I've got some questions which I'm going to pose to Tom, and I'll chip in where I've got thoughts too. So we'll start, Tom, with given the sort of rhetoric around the war on the motorists, which has now largely gone away. What do you think we can expect now in terms of policy support for sustainable transport?
It's a really nice question to start with. And I suppose my immediate response is to question whether the war on the motorist has truly gone away,
Mm.
in that obviously it was part of the culture wars. It was something which the Conservatives thought might win them some more votes in the run up to the election. So that's why they went for it. And presumably the Uxbridge by-election gave them additional confidence. That doesn't mean that the incoming Labour administration is suddenly going to be harder on drivers. I think it is a very brave political party that is willing to face down what is thought as the driver or the roads lobby, perhaps more generally, just because it's such a large part of the voting populace and it's associated with massive industries which are really important to the country. So I suppose I'm equivocating a bit. The war on the motorist, in inverted commas, may be over, but I think what might be implied by that, a true engagement with the promotion of alternatives to the car, well, we'll have to see.
Mm.
I think
Mm.
that what we've had from the Labour government so far is an interesting, if mixed, picture, and we'll have to see whether they go full Prescott, if I can call it that, because he famously, notoriously committed himself to reducing car travel, and it cost him dear in political terms. And I wonder whether what is clearly a very canny Labour administration will see the risks of doing the same.
I think I think very fair points, and perhaps those of us who've just found the last year or so with that background of the war on the motorists and the need to stop that, maybe we're looking through rose-tinted glasses a little bit too much and being a little bit too optimistic about the future without having had the detail that really the evidence that's really going to back up that we're right. And of course, we have to cater for the car. The car is a really important mode of travel and enables many people to go places that they need to, but let's do that alongside looking at the right mode for the right journey. Um,
Mm.
so I want to touch first on national policy and then think a little bit more about local policy. And if we start with national policy, the Labour manifesto and subsequent communications releases that they've been talking to have raised expectations of a new long-term strategy for transport, something I know the Transport Planning Society has also called for. Do you support that long-term strategy for transport? And if so, how would you go about it?
Depending on what kind of strategy we mean, definitely.
Mm.
And I suppose that's the starting point, is to say, well, what do we mean by strategy? Because there are lots of different sorts of things that are called strategy, and only some of them really deserve the title. So I would say one example is the RIS, the Road Investment Strategy, which is what I would call a strategy because it's a list of things that are going to happen. And many other documents, particularly those that come out of government, probably don't deserve to be called strategy because they're more expressions of wishes and a degree of celebration of past achievements rather than anything that you could call a firm commitment for the future. So something which is a clear statement about the future is essential if we're going to call it a
Mm.
strategy. But then you're immediately into quite difficult territory because once you have written that you're going to do a certain thing by a certain date, you've set yourself up as a kind of hostage to fortune. And I'm old enough to remember the 10-year plan that was produced in, I think it was 2000, again, under the previous Labour government. And it ended up being a bit of a fiasco because it meant that people had to construct rather elaborate arguments about whether a certain number of tram lines meant a certain number of sections of tram lines as opposed to individual schemes, all because I think the government had somewhat tied itself in knots by making quite specific commitments. And there's
Mm.
another side to this, which is if we're talking about an atmosphere of devolution, which everyone is quite excited about, we probably need to limit the extent to which top down government appears to be saying that it will be thus. And I suppose that leads me to think that to the extent that we call it a strategy or not, what would be most welcome would be a series of principles governing how transport is going
Hmm.
to work in the country from now on. And those might relate to, well, how do we actually do decarbonisation? What will be the principles by which we decide whether a scheme is a good thing or not? Is that a strategy? I don't know. We don't probably need to get into the philosophy of it, but that's probably the kind of thing I would welcome, as opposed to some exhaustive list of all the things which are going to happen over the coming years.
Mm. I think when I think about what it needs to do, it's about making that commitment that's certainly lacking at the moment at a national level, and recognition of the need to reduce car miles travelled, distance travelled, if we're going to realise our carbon goals. And the other thing actually is sort of how we deal with interurban trips and trips that are passing through many local areas, which therefore can't be dealt with through that local policy. What's your views though on that national commitment to reducing car miles travelled? Do you think that's something we can expect from the new Labour government?
Well, they need to. Whether they've got the guts to do it is another matter. And I suppose I refer back to my earlier comment
Mm.
about not scaring the horses. And I think this is probably, for me, the biggest question mark associated with what I've seen so far from Labour, in that they remain committed, it seems, to net zero. They have a near fixation on economic growth. And I would have to describe myself as someone who is skeptical about green growth. Therefore, I find a very serious tension between the potential achievement of net zero and this idea that it's going to be done at the same time as we are growing GDP in a big way, which is not to say that I'm disputing the arguments for growing GDP, though I would if we were having a different conversation. It's simply that if you do grow GDP, you can generally expect car miles to increase because that's a very well established relationship. It's not
Mm.
axiomatic, but it is well established. It's got a long history. So, are we going to just electrify? Well, definitely that won't be enough, and it brings its own problems. We do, as you say, really need to reduce the amount of car based movement. And this just brings us up against that same problem of probably telling people that they need to drive less. And that's something which
Mm.
has rarely been a palatable message for anyone in government to convey. And as we've seen from the fair amount of unpleasantness associated with things such as low traffic neighborhoods and even 15-minute cities, the the populace seems unready to swallow that as a proposition. It's all going to have to be couched in terms of, well, we're going to continue to make the alternatives much more attractive. We're going to make it easy to walk and cycle. And obviously, we've seen things from Labour about buses and trains, which are clearly intended to make those better and more attractive forms of transport. So the idea is it's all going to be carrots and we
Mm.
shouldn't need any sticks. Sticks are, in political terms, exceptionally difficult to deliver.
Yeah. You said something there, to quote, telling people they need to travel differently. And I think that's what we need to be very careful to avoid. And something actually I want to come back to later in this conversation is I think there is a willingness amongst the population to do their bit and reduce their carbon consumption, their individual carbon consumption when we can. I think we see examples of that across lots of different sectors. And I think there is an opportunity to bring the population much more into making choices and designing transport projects and programs that perhaps work for them rather than that top down. So perhaps that takes us back to that national strategy and how you develop it and how you bring people with you in setting that agenda. Okay, should we
Well,
move?
if I may, you would
Yeah,
be
yeah,
disappointed if I didn't talk about road pricing,
yeah.
because no self-respecting transport academic can get through half an hour without talking about it. And it's a particularly poignant issue because we know that the Treasury is going to be facing an ever larger gap in its finances as the duty on fuel diminishes in terms of revenue. So whether or not they like it, I think that the Labour government is going to be faced with the need to find another way of generating income from
Mm,
people's travel by car. And
mm.
obviously, there is the argument that you could do that at the same time as tackling some of the worst externalities associated with car travel.
And that again, I suppose, is a role for that national transport strategy. If it set out the principles, as you talked to, you'd rather see a strategy which perhaps set out some principles that introducing road pricing will be a necessity, and it would like local authorities to consider those plans and bring them forward in the most appropriate way.
Yeah, again, we've got some history to draw on here, which is that, again, I think it was Labour that decided to pull back from doing it at a national level and invited individual
Mm,
urban areas to come up with their
mm,
own proposals. And there was a sweetener there, so they would get money to pay for improvements in exchange. But as a result, we saw things such as the Manchester road pricing referendum. So there's no guarantee that that kind of thing can be effectively devolved. That sort of thing, I suspect, has to be done at the national level,
yeah,
even if its implementation is going to be varying very dramatically from place to place, given that
yeah,
congestion is hardly the same.
yeah. Okay. Let's move on then to local policy, and we as a profession have been waiting for the new local transport planning guidance for what I think is now years. It's certainly a long time, over a year rather than months. Do you think that is still important? Do we still need that new guidance to come out?
You're saying that just made me think of someone waiting at a bus stop, and then someone else comes along and they say, "Oh, what are you waiting for?" "Oh, well, I'm waiting for the new manual for street." "Oh, right, yeah. Oh, and I'm waiting for them to make a decision on pavement parking." "What about you?" "Oh, the LTP guidance." Well, we'll be over here a while, I suspect. Okay, so on LTPs, I think everyone looks back on them quite fondly because they were associated with a time of greater certainty about funding and perhaps just a slightly less austere situation
Mm,
for local government. Whether they were the panacea, I think, is less clear. And there's not been anything stopping people from continuing to produce them, but very few have. And that suggests that there isn't a huge appetite in local government to write long documents just for the sake of it. I think we need to remember that LTPs were a means to an end. They helped local authorities to negotiate with government over the money that they would then be able to spend on their interventions. And I suspect that if that were still the way in which LTPs worked, then we would be very glad of their return. But if I may, I feel I have to draw attention to the major commitments in terms of house building.
mm,
And it's a really old chestnut, but the lack of integration between transport and land use planning continues to be a serious impediment in this
yeah,
country.
yeah.
So if we are in a position to bring out new guidance, how about we try to bridge that gap and insist that there is a coherence between what local authorities say about their transport and the housing which they know they're going to have to build, so that we're no longer allowing these things to operate separately from each other, which is always such a misstep.
It seems an obvious thing to do, doesn't it? So many of these things seem obvious things to do. What's going to be the barrier to letting that happen? Bringing the right government departments together to make progress and quickly enough, I suppose.
Gosh, I keep talking about history because I remember what was laughingly called the Department for Everything in the early days of the Blair government. DETR, then subsequently DTLR, as various concatenations of transport and planning were attempted. And the fact that they eventually split up suggests that people concluded it just wasn't workable, which is a terrible shame, isn't it? Maybe the answer does lie at the more localized level, where there are fewer barriers to truly integrated planning. That might be fanciful, but I'd love to
Mm,
think that that is the case. So, let central government do what it must. Perhaps we can persuade the powers that be to create a kind of unified guidance of the sort we were just discussing. And then the individual authorities, and they come in so many different forms in England at least, can figure out for themselves how best to convert that guidance into what I would call integrated land use and transport planning.
mm,
Um, I, I think it's extremely easy for me to say, and it's a very different matter
yeah,
for individual authorities to deliver it. But I really hope that this opportunity will be taken and we won't simply continue down the same old track of, oh, well, we've got this housing which we've got to put there. And elsewhere in the building, perhaps somewhere down the road, we've got colleagues who are writing a transport plan.
yeah. No, absolutely. But yeah, maybe I'm usually an optimistic soul, Tom, as you know, but I do fear this has been something that has been called upon for so long and is such an obvious fix to make. I do think we're heading in that direction. There's definitely conversations going on, aren't there, about bringing these two things closer together. But we need to see movement quickly. And I think for the local authorities that have been reluctant to update their local transport plans whilst waiting for the guidance that was to come, they're missing the opportunity to really have that strong policy framework behind them to perhaps bring forward some of the plans and programs that they need to do so today. Um, so we do need a lever to encourage those authorities, I think, to move quickly now in developing their plans. And I fear if we do something very difficult and we wait a long time for it, we also go backwards a little bit while we wait.
I think you're quite right. And you should never trust an academic to set anyone's policy. Having said that, I have been encouraged by what I've heard so far from the ministers in question. So I suppose it's reasonable to be hopeful. They
Mm,
are moving quickly,
yeah,
and
yeah.
maybe not as we would necessarily desire, but there's a lot that's good about what we've seen so far. So I guess I'm going to be optimistic. If you're having an optimism deficit, I'll fill in for you.
Okay, let's move on to another question. So we've touched on this already, but we know that we need to reduce overall distance travelled by cars if we're going to meet our carbon commitments. We cannot rely only on a transition to electric vehicles, although that is important alongside. So, given our experience in delivering a reduction in car miles driven through nudging behaviours, what advice could we give to new ministers on how to bring that change forward?
Yeah, well, I suppose this does take us back to the question of road pricing mentioned earlier. It seems to me that what we've seen so far is indicative of the natural tendency to look at the big ticket stuff first. So we've heard about buses and we've heard about rail, and naturally the government is seeing those two as being crucial parts of the picture. And I'm sure they're absolutely right about that. There hasn't been much about active travel yet, so people in my community might be feeling a little bit unloved, but we're confident that that will change. So it comes back to this business of carrots and sticks. We can improve the public transport offer for all we're worth. We can make it more efficient, more reliable. We might even make it cheaper if we think we can find the money to do that, though money continues to be a very significant concern, I think. Will that be enough?
Mm,
Well, I have my doubts, and I think you and I have the shared experience that there are reasons why people continue to drive their cars. And the suggestion that they're on the brink of switching to an alternative, if only some marginal change takes place, has always seemed to me to be unrealistic. There are, as you have said, lots of reasons why cars are widely used. They're extremely useful. And that's before we get into the business of how we have a car culture and we have designed our country to cater to the car. So if you just leave that to one side, the simple fact that people can climb into this device and be taken directly to their destination without stopping, without having to make any intermediate, or sorry, without having to take any detours. I speak as someone who took a lot of public transport yesterday, and it's weighing heavily on me. So the car is going to continue to be this convenient unless we make it less so. And
Yeah.
that's a really difficult truth.
It is, and I think we have to recognise the importance of that car, but we also have to recognise it has its inconveniences too. In many cases, people would value the time, and actually, the time we spend on our phones these days doing so many different things that can easily be done on public transport, for example, is a reason why travelling by another mode is attractive if that other mode is there. But I wonder if we're really thinking enough, and the work we've done before, Tom, that we know car use is a habit. We've spoken to enough people that we understand that regular people, not transport planners, really go about their day-to-day business, and they're not giving much thought to what mode of transport they're traveling on. They're giving thought to where they need to get to and what time they need to get there, and they are typically using the convenient mode of transport that they always have done, because they've not really gone into looking at what the alternatives are for them. Um, and I think if we could become a little bit more people centric and think about how we engage with people about the places they need to go and the activities they need to go, rather than being so mode driven about making improvements to modes, out being more people centric. I think that's the real opportunity for me.
Yes, I think I agree with you. And yeah, the behavioral science would suggest the same. So improve the alternatives and then invite people to reassess their choices. You're right,
Yeah.
they're probably inured to driving the car because they do so unthinkingly, and this is how most of us do most of the things we do. So once you have made significant improvements to the alternatives and perhaps, dare I say it, somewhat removed some of the convenience of the car, then the balance should have shifted, and that people focused approach to the conversation about how you make your journeys, or for that matter, which journeys you make, can be assessed anew with, we would hope, a non negligible shift away from the car.
Yeah. We just need to recognize that that won't happen just because the new infrastructure or the new service is put there, right? It needs to be complemented with some sort of promotion, encouragement, awareness of that new service or that new infrastructure that's been placed there. And I think when we divvy up funding pots at the moment and we dedicate them to those different modes of transport, we're not necessarily dedicating a funding pot to also how are we going to ensure that once it's there, we're going to get maximum value out of it and really bring people forward to use that.
Yes, well, in fact, this is where I have to raise one of my complaints, which is the frequency with which I hear the term behavior change used to describe communications work that's going to complement infrastructure or
Mm,
changes to service patterns. And I lead a module on behavior change, and one of the things I browbeat the students with is the idea that the vast majority of what we do in transport is actually intended to change behavior. Some of it
yeah,
isn't, but the vast majority
yeah,
is. And so you're right, we should be thinking in an integrated way about everything. So the offer, what buses run where, what they cost, whether they're comfortable, and so on, and then how we make people aware of them, and whether we make people think of them as being an alternative that they would seriously consider. So all of these things have to operate in concert if we're going to achieve the
mm,
change we need.
mm. And I can't miss the opportunity to remind us that we've done this before. The Department of Transport has invested a lot of money back in the mid 2000s in the sustainable travel towns, intending to really understand what proper investment, if you like, in the promotion and the encouragement for people in those three towns, which were Darlington, Peterborough, and Worcester, what programs to intensively promote those towns and sustainable transport use in those towns would bring about. And those programs were very thoroughly evaluated, and there was some really good outcomes. And we saw a reduction, if I recall correctly, of around a 10% reduction in car miles traveled. And so we've done this before, and we could probably do even more now with the technology advancements. We've got new modes of transport since programs like that existed. And I think, these programs cost a very small part of the sum of the investment in new infrastructure or new service, and I think should be given more consideration in the new
I'd
agenda.
agree with you. The only caveat is that in those towns, not a great deal changed about the transport offer. So what was achieved was significant and very impressive, all things considered. But the bus services remained largely the same. With some exceptions, the cycling facilities were not changed. So that we were able to see a change in people's behaviour without significant change
Mm,
to the transport offer is remarkable, and I
mm,
suppose gives us even more confidence that if you then did a combined job of dramatically improving the public transport offer, say, or the active travel opportunities in a place, and did a very decent job of the communication side of things, well, we could see something quite special, I think.
yeah, really good. All right. Question to finish on. What are the quick wins, do you think, for the new government around sustainable transport? What would you do to make ground quickly?
Well, you might expect this answer, but I would say very significant money into active travel
Mm,
because it it delivers an astonishing bang for buck and can be done comparatively quickly when you think of the time it takes to deliver major transport infrastructure such as a new railway line. So that would be money spent and a return seen within a very short period of time. And this obviously has huge benefits in terms of public health and air quality, quite aside from the hoped for improvements in terms of climate emissions and congestion. So that's where I would start. The other things aren't terribly quick, I would say. I mean, obviously, it's also relatively quick to kill off road schemes.
mm,
So uh, whether you would see that as a win very much depends on which side of the fence you're on. I would generally say that any road scheme is going to be hard to justify. So would tend to support the government in killing off as many as possible.
right. Right.
There's an interesting piece by Phil Goodwin, actually, which you might want to look at in Tapas, which discusses that at some length and helpfully explores the issues.
Okay, thanks. Good call out. And for those listening, just want to build on your active travel point, and I think it's about not talking about active travel as just a mode in itself, but it's the potential for active travel, isn't it, to further build on bus and rail journeys and everything else. It's not just for those people who can travel short distance by active travel. It's importance in enabling people to also use public transport to providing that non-car access.
Well, thank you for making that point, and you're absolutely right. The first point is that we must remember walking has a huge contribution to make here, and it's something which Chris Boardman has identified, as have others, because walking is so much more prominent in our overall travel habits than cycling. That is where the gains can be made, and it's such a cliche. It's almost painful to say it, but walking or wheeling play a part in pretty much every journey and certainly play a part in every public transport journey. So yes,
Yeah.
if you improve active travel and you do it right, you are vastly aiding the public transport network in its prospects of A, being at least breaking even or maybe even turning a profit, and B, achieving the goal of supporting a lot of the strategic movement which is currently being taken made by car.
I'm going to add one very quick other point. Another ask from me is very simple and really doesn't need to cost much money. Is bringing together the good work that we already do, because actually there is a lot of good work in sustainable transport happening in different local authorities around the country, and there are different local authorities reinventing that wheel and too often starting again from the beginning. So let's get more sharing of the good practice that's out there, um, shared in the public domain and with local authority officers easily able to access that. And I think that could really help us move forward quickly. I'm going to get into trouble if I don't wind us up soon. So I want to say a huge thank you to you, Tom, for giving us your time and participating in this discussion and sharing your insight. And thanks also to our audience for joining in too. So we have a further session planned for today at 2 o'clock on the future of buses, specifically with regards to funding and franchising. So please do join us again later for that one. And next week, we've got our final session coming up on rail. There we go. I'm being all mode specific again. If you haven't signed up for that one, please visit our website. So with that, it's a goodbye from Tom.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Tom, and a goodbye from me. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.